Welcome to Workers' Compensation, and we're going to start with Chapter 1, which is really an introduction to the workers' compensation system. The focus of this chapter is to introduce you to the basic concept in a workers' compensation system, including an outline of the basic premise of workers' compensation, where employees surrender certain rights in order to come under the coverage of the system, and employers agree to pay into that system. This chapter also outlines the basic concepts of the benefit structure system that is found in the workers' compensation system. So what is workers' compensation? In its most basic form, it's a form of insurance that guarantees compensation to injured workers, and it'll pay for their medical expenses, for their rehabilitation, and their weekly wages until the employee is recovered sufficiently to return to work. Under the workers' compensation system, an employee waives his or her right to bring an independent action for a work-related injury. Employers who actually fund the workers' compensation system cannot be sued in civil court for workers' injuries. So essentially, both parties give up something of value in exchange for greater security. So on one side, employees give up rights to bring independent suits in exchange for more or less guaranteed awards for injuries. Employers, on the other side, pay into that system, that insurance system, and that system is more liberal in making awards to injured employees than that of the civil system. But the benefit to employers is an assurance that they will not be hit with large jury awards from civil cases. So there's benefits and there's detriments on both sides of the coin. So the basic premise of this workers' compensation, this insurance system, is that an injured worker will receive a specified monetary award based on their injury. And under this system, the parties don't have to waste time and resources pursuing personal injury actions in civil courts that are already gummed up and way behind. So as you can see, this is a pretty simple system in theory, but this simple idea has really spawned, as we'll see, an entire industry of lawyers, of doctors, insurance companies, and an entire branch of law, which we're studying here, that is devoted specifically to adjudicating these types of claims. So who pays for this system? In a normal insurance setup, if you buy insurance on yourself, you're going to pay it. So we would expect to see that the employee is paying for this insurance benefit. But that's not the case. Under the workers' compensation laws, it's employers that are paying into this insurance system that ultimately will benefit both sides. The amount that an employer pays is based on a lot of different factors. For instance, the number of employees they have, how dangerous their jobs are, and their experience with employees getting injured on the job in the past. The vast majority of employers have independent insurance carriers that handle this system for them. On the other side, payment amounts, payments to the employees, to the injured workers, are determined by preset formulas. For instance, there's so much money allotted if you injure your hand. There's another amount that's allotted if you injure your foot, your spine, your head, your fingers, so on. When there's a dispute between what the employer says and what the employee says, there's a third-party workers' compensation board that is empowered to make binding decisions on amounts. They don't make determinations of liability or fault. Remember, this is a no-fault system. But the Workers' Compensation Board is part of state government and has the right to reinstate or modify benefits. Just take you through a brief history of workers' compensation. The workers' compensation movement really began at the early part of the 20th century, and it was in direct response to the Industrial Revolution and the problems with injured workers that the Industrial Revolution spawned. Prior to the institution of workers' compensation statutes and this insurance system, really the only recourse that an injured employee had was to sue the employers. And tort law at the turn of the 20th century was really heavily favored towards employers. And of course they had the money to defend against these suits. So the system was biased against employees. Just to give you an idea of how biased it was, some of the defenses that employers regularly succeeded with are that the employee assumed the risk just by coming to work, or that it was somehow the employee's fault because of negligence, or that it was somebody else's fault entirely. Now, as state legislatures started to recognize this bias system, they started to take a look at European-style workers' compensation statutes. And around the turn of the second decade, 1913, 1914 time, is when we started to see really dramatic changes in the workers' compensation system and started to see states enact workers' compensation statute. And one thing that's important to understand about the workers' compensation system is it requires what's called an exclusiveness of remedy. And that means that this system is usually the only form through which the parties, the employer and the employee, can work out their differences. Injured workers must bring their claims through this workers' compensation, or not at all. And that's one of the, again, the downsides. So the employers pay in to this insurance system, and in exchange the employees can only go to that system for most cases. Remember, personal injury lawsuits are some of the most common lawsuits in the United States today, and the civil courts are really gummed up for years and years with these types of lawsuits. But again, under workers' compensation, if you're injured at work, this is your exclusive remedy going through the workers' compensation system. Now, an important question to answer is, does this workers' compensation system, these statutes, violate the Constitution? We know that as American citizens, we have a guaranteed right of access to the courts. And so this situation has been litigated again and again. If a statute requires employees to submit their claims to the Workers' Compensation Board and bars them from bringing a civil suit, is that an unconstitutional infringement of a citizen's right? And courts have consistently answered this question by saying no. Although the exclusiveness of this remedy does abridge an important right, the new rights conferred by the statutes outweigh the rights lost. At least that's the argument that's always been the winner. So again, workers' compensation statutes are a balancing act. They both confer rights and remove others. So the next question is, now that we know that these statutes exist, we need to determine who's covered by workers' compensation statutes. Obviously, because if you fall under the statute as an employee, you can avail yourself of this insurance system, and if you fall outside of the statute, you have to bring suit in a civil court. So two questions we need to ask and have answered. Is the person an employee with regard to the statute, and is the injury itself covered? And as you're studying the answers to these questions, there's a good checklist you might want to look at on page 6 and 7 of your book. So let's answer these questions. Who is covered under workers' compensation? Obviously, if you are an employee with regards to the statute, you'll probably receive some kind of medical treatment, payment of medical bills, weekly income, and so on if you are injured. If you're not covered, then you must sue the employer for these benefits. So this is an important distinction. Now, traditionally, these types of people are covered. Employees who are employed by a for-profit business, who work for counties and towns, municipalities in hazardous areas, public school teachers, there are some important exceptions there, employees who work 40 or more hours a week, seasonal or agricultural workers who earn $1,200 or more, any other employee deemed covered by the State Board of Workers' Compensation. People who are not traditionally covered under workers' compensation, clergy, priests, teachers at religious institutions, Catholic schools, and so on, members of the merchant marines and other seagoing professions, railroad workers, federal employees, casual laborers, employees of foreign governments, sole proprietors, and other small business owners. Now, in the coming chapters, we're going to get much more specific about whether or not individuals fall underneath the auspices of the statute and whether or not the injury is covered by the statute. But for right now, just take those general categories and we'll work with those. So again, if you fall under the system, the type of benefits available to you include your medical expenses, anything resulting from the injury, any income you would have otherwise earned during the injury or illness period. There's specific death benefits and there's specific burial benefits if you're ultimately or the employee is ultimately killed on the job. Let's take just a second and look at each one of these individually. The big one is medical expenses, right? And the medical expenses, any medical expenses that are considered reasonable or necessary to the employee must be paid by the insurance company. And again, one of the big areas we look at here is whether or not the medical bills flow from the injury or illness itself, or whether it's caused by something else. In addition to paying medical bills, it's also going to provide the injured employee some income during the period that they can't work. It's only for the period that you're unable to return to work because of a work-related injury or illness, and it's not usually the entire amount you would have earned. It's a percentage of the employee's total income. Now, if in a worst case scenario the employee is actually killed, there are some compensation triggers to pay family members for income lost because of the employee's death. There's a very limited number of family members qualified to receive these death benefits, such as children and spouses. And if it applies, the workers' compensation insurance will also pay a benefit for the employee's funeral expenses to try to defray funeral expenses. Now, as we've previously mentioned, the compensation is going to be based on how or where the employee is injured, but in a lot of cases that's not too clear. So one of the things that the Workers' Compensation Board is to determine, or that the Workers' Compensation Board does, is to determine the extent of an employee's injuries and whether or not they are work-related. And that's, of course, appealable if the employee doesn't agree with the outcome. As part of this process, the employee may be asked to submit to a medical examination by professionals that are actually hired by the employer. The board will also hold a hearing to determine what benefits, if any, should be awarded to the employee. Now, all those topics we've just talked about, we will talk about in much more depth as we work our way through this semester, but I just wanted to give you a general overview of the workers' compensation system. Before we finish, there's a couple of special scenarios I'd like to talk about. The first deals with firefighters and law enforcement officers. This is something that we talked a lot about following 9/11, right, and all of the lung problems that first responders are having up there. But sometimes there is a statutory protection when it comes to defining an accident or an injury. Specifically, 9/11 is a great example. In this case, a statute may require that an administrative law judge or workers' compensation appeals board presume that a certain disease is caused by a certain working conditions. Think asbestos, think the lung conditions that are associated with 9/11, so on. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is the idea that this insurance benefit, like any insurance benefit, can be denied if there is fraud involved. So any employee that engages in fraud and tries to game the system, employee fraud in pretending they're injured, or medical billing fraud, claims can be denied based on that fraud. So just to summarize what we've talked about, workers' compensation is a statutory system. It's created to protect employees and provide a mechanism for compensating them if they're injured on the job. Employees who are injured on the job are entitled to monetary compensation for lost wages, medical bills, and rehab in some cases. In exchange for these payments, the employee surrenders the right to bring a separate civil action against the employer. Employers, on the other hand, or employers' insurance carriers, pay the workers' claims. Workers' compensation statutes insulate employers from liability claims in civil suits, thus avoiding the possibility of a large award on behalf of an employee. However, with this advantage comes several disadvantages. The rules regarding employee awards are more liberal. Employees are free to contest denial of benefits on the amount of the employer award. Workers' compensation is an exclusive remedy, meaning that employees and employers are barred from other civil actions and must contest the issues through the Workers' Compensation Board. Monetary benefits under this system include medical bills, rehab costs, partial reimbursement for lost wages, death benefits, and burial benefits. And that's a quick overview of the workers' compensation system as it relates to Chapter 1. When we come back next time, we'll talk about Chapter 2. In the meantime, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Have a great day.